The scream tore through the blackthorn hall before anyone could stop it. Alena froze at the top of the staircase, her hand gripping the cold stone railing, watching as her sister Mira collapsed to her knees in front of the entire pack. Gideon Ashford, the Alpha King, stood over her with his jaw locked tight and his eyes burning gold, the color they turned only when his wolf pushed close to the surface. Something had gone wrong. Something had gone wrong only minutes before the claiming ceremony was supposed to begin, and now 300 pack members stood frozen in the hall, waiting to see what their king would do next. Alena did not know yet that this night would change everything. She only knew that her sister was on the floor, shaking, and that the man who was supposed to claim her as his mate within the hour looked like he was ready to tear the entire hall apart with his bare hands. She ran down the stairs before she could think better of it. The old rivalry between the Blackthorn and Ashford Parks had lasted longer than anyone could remember. Grandfathers had died fighting grandfathers. Territory lines had been redrawn in blood more times than the elders could count on both hands. When the war finally became too costly for either side to keep paying, the two Alpha Councils had come to an agreement that neither pack fully believed in, but both were desperate enough to accept. A mating bond. A joining of bloodlines. The only kind of peace that wolves truly respected, because it could not be broken by politics or pride. It could only be broken by death, and no one wanted to be the one responsible for that. Alena had grown up hearing about this agreement the way other children had bedtime stories, except this one was real, and it had always belonged to her sister. Mira was the elder twin, born 4 minutes before Alena, and in wolf tradition those 4 minutes meant everything. Mira carried the stronger bloodline magic, the kind that could stabilize a throne and calm a room full of angry wolves with a single word. Alena had her own gifts, quieter ones, the kind that healed wounds and noticed things other people missed, but no one had ever called her gifts useful for a crown. So when the Ashford envoys arrived 3 weeks ago to finalize the arrangement, Alena had stood beside her sister and watched Gideon Ashford study them both with the same detached calculation a man might use to inspect livestock. His gaze had barely touched Alena before settling on Mira, and within the hour, the announcement was made. Mira would be his mate. Mira would help him rule 2 packs instead of 1. Alena would be there too, of course, because twins were never truly separated in wolf society, but she would be there as a sister, not as anything more. She told herself she did not mind. She had told herself that every single day for 3 weeks, right up until the moment Mira grabbed her wrist outside the sacred grove the night before the ceremony and begged her for a favor that would ruin everything. It had started small. Mira was supposed to deliver a peace offering to Gideon that evening, a private tradition observed the night before any claiming, meant to give the mated pair one quiet moment together before the entire pack witnessed their bond. But Mira was shaking, her hands cold, her breath coming too fast, and she confessed to Alena that she could not do it. She could not walk into that grove and sit across from a man she barely knew and pretend her heart was not somewhere else entirely, tangled up with a boy from a neighboring territory that their parents would never approve of. Alena had wanted to refuse. She really had. But Myra's eyes were wet and desperate, and twins did not know how to say no to each other, not when it mattered, not when the fear was this real. So Alena took the offering basket from her sister's trembling hands, put a plain grey cloak over her shoulders, and walked into the grove alone, telling herself it would only take a few minutes. She would hand over the offering, bow, and leave before anyone noticed the difference between the two sisters in the dim evening light. She had not expected to find Gideon Ashford sitting on the ground with his back against an ancient oak tree, looking nothing like the ruthless king the stories described. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had not slept properly in years, and when he glanced up at her approach, there was no hardness in his face at all, only a kind of quiet exhaustion that made him seem younger than his reputation suggested. "You're early," he said, his voice low and rough. Alena should have corrected him immediately. She should have said that she was not Mira, that she was only delivering the offering on her sister's behalf, that this entire meeting was a mistake that needed to end before it began. But something about the way he looked at her, like she was simply a person and not a political solution to a decade of bloodshed, made the words stick in her throat. So she said nothing. She sat down across from him instead, setting the offering basket on the ground between them, and told herself she would explain everything in a moment. The moment never came. Gideon talked, and Alena listened, and somewhere in the space of an hour the conversation stopped being about treaties and bloodlines and started being about the things neither of them ever said out loud to anyone. He told her about the crushing weight of ruling alone, about the nights he stood on the watchtower wondering if any of the decisions he made actually mattered, about the loneliness that came with being feared by everyone who was supposed to love him. Alena, moved by an honesty she had never expected from the man everyone described as cold, found herself answering with the same rawness. She spoke about being the quiet twin, the overlooked one, the sister whose gifts never seemed to count for anything in a world that measured worth in bloodline magic and political usefulness. Neither of them said her name once. Neither of them needed to. By the time the moon reached its highest point above the grove, something had shifted between them that Alena could not name and was too afraid to examine. It was not romantic in the way the stories described. It was quieter than that, and somehow more dangerous, because it felt real in a way that nothing about the arranged bond had ever felt. She left before sunrise, slipping out of the grove while Gideon was still half asleep against the oak tree, and she told herself the entire walk home that it had meant nothing. It was a mistake born from tiredness and desperation, a strange accident that would be forgotten by morning. She was wrong. The scream that pulled her out of her room at dawn had nothing to do with the grove, or so she thought at first. She ran down the stairs expecting some kind of pack emergency, a border dispute, an injured warrior, anything that made sense in the ordinary chaos of pack life. Instead she found her sister on the floor of the great hall, sobbing, with Gideon standing over her looking like a man who had just discovered a lie so large it threatened to collapse everything he had built. "Tell her," Gideon said, his voice dangerously calm in the way that meant he was holding back something enormous. "Tell your sister what you did." Mira looked up at Alena with an expression that mixed guilt and terror in equal measure. "He knows," she whispered. "Alena, he knows it wasn't me in the grove." The hall went silent except for the low murmur of confusion spreading through the gathered pack members. Alena felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Gideon turned to face her fully now, and the exhaustion from the night before was gone, replaced by something sharper, something that made her chest ache in a way she did not understand. "You were the one in the grove," he said. It was not a question. Alena could not lie to him. Not after last night. Not with 300 pairs of eyes watching her, waiting for an answer that would either confirm or destroy the fragile peace both packs had spent years building. "Yes," she said quietly. "It was me." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the entire hall. Somewhere behind her, an elder gasped. Somewhere to her left, a pack warrior muttered something about broken tradition. Alena kept her eyes on Gideon, refusing to look away even as her heart pounded hard enough to hurt. For a long moment, no one spoke. Gideon studied her with an intensity that made her feel like the only person in the room, and Alena understood, with a kind of dawning horror, that whatever had happened between them in the grove had not stayed in the grove at all. It had followed them both into the morning light, and now it stood between her and her sister, between two packs and a fragile peace, refusing to be ignored. "This changes things," Gideon said finally, and the words hung heavy in the air, promising nothing good and everything uncertain. An elder named Edric stepped forward from the crowd, his weathered face pale with worry. He had helped negotiate this peace for 3 long years, traveling between territories, smoothing over old wounds that refused to fully close. He looked between Gideon and the two sisters with the expression of a man watching his life's work crumble in front of him. "My king," Edric said carefully, "the ceremony is set to begin within the hour. Every wolf from both packs has already gathered outside these walls. If word spreads that something has gone wrong before the bond is even sealed, we risk undoing everything we have built." Gideon did not look at Edric. His eyes stayed fixed on Alena, as though he was trying to solve a puzzle that had rearranged itself overnight without warning. "Leave us," he said, and though his voice was quiet, no one in that hall dared question it. The pack members filed out slowly, casting uncertain glances over their shoulders, until only Gideon, Alena, Mira, and Edric remained standing in the vast, echoing space. Mira pushed herself up from the floor, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. "This is my fault," she said, her voice cracking. "I asked her to go. I begged her. Alena didn't want to do it, but I was scared, and I wasn't thinking about what it might mean. What did it mean? Gideon asked, his gaze finally shifting to Mira, though it returned to Elena a moment later, as though pulled by something he could not control. Mira hesitated, glancing at her sister before answering. I don't know what happened between you two last night. But I know my sister came home different this morning. Quieter. And I have never seen you look at anyone the way you're looking at her right now. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything Elena had experienced in her entire life. She could feel Edric's eyes on her, calculating the political disaster unfolding in real time, and she could feel Gideon's eyes on her too, though he held something else entirely, something that made her pulse race despite the danger surrounding them. I need time, Gideon said finally, dragging a hand through his dark hair. I cannot walk out there in an hour and claim a bond one no longer understands. Edric's expression tightened with alarm. My king, with respect, the wolves from both territories are already restless. Postponing the ceremony now, today, could be read as an insult by the Blackthorn elders. It could unravel 3 years of careful negotiation in a single afternoon. Then I will speak with the elders myself, Gideon said, his tone leaving no room for argument. But I will not stand in front of my pack and make a promise I am not certain I can keep. Elena's chest tightened at his words. She had spent her entire life being the twin no one noticed, the sister whose gifts never seemed to matter as much as bloodline magic or political usefulness, and now, standing in the center of a crumbling ceremony, she felt the full weight of being noticed for the first time. It should have felt like everything she had ever wanted. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with the wind pushing hard against her back. I should not have gone last night, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. None of this would be happening if I had just told you the truth the moment I arrived. Gideon's gaze snapped to her, sharp and immediate. Do not apologize for last night, he said, and the intensity in his voice startled everyone in the room, including himself, judging by the way his jaw tightened afterward as though he wished he could pull the words back. That is the only honest conversation I have had with anyone in years. Mira let out a small, shaky breath beside her, and Elena saw something complicated pass across her sister's face, not quite anger, not quite relief, but something tangled between the two. Edric shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that he was witnessing something far beyond his ability to manage with diplomacy alone. We need to postpone, Gideon said finally, turning to Edric with the same commanding tone that had once ended a border skirmish with a single sentence. Tell the elders there has been a complication in the bloodline verification. By me until sunset. Edric looked as though he wanted to argue, but one look at Gideon's face convinced him otherwise. He bowed stiffly and hurried out of the hall, leaving the three of them alone in a silence that felt like standing at the center of a storm that had not yet decided which direction to move. Mira reached for Elena's hand, squeezing it once. I'm sorry, she whispered. I never meant for any of this to happen. Elena squeezed back, though her eyes remained on Gideon, who had turned away from them both to stare out the tall windows at the park gathering restlessly beyond the hall's stone walls. Somewhere out there, 300 wolves from two once warring territories waited for a ceremony that suddenly hung by the thinnest thread imaginable, and Elena understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that whatever happened next would decide far more than just her own fate. It would decide whether the fragile peace between two packs survived the sunrise at all. Word of the postponement spread through both packs faster than anyone anticipated, and by mid-afternoon the whispers had already twisted into something far more dangerous than the truth. Some said the Alpha King had rejected his intended mate at the last moment. Others claimed the Blackthorn bloodline had failed some hidden test of worthiness. A few, closer to accurate than they realized, murmured about a mysterious woman seen leaving the sacred grove at dawn, though no one yet dared connect that rumor to either twin directly. Elena stayed hidden in her chambers through the worst of it, listening to the low hum of anxious voices drifting up from the courtyard below. She had never wanted attention, had spent her whole life stepping back so her sister could stand in the light, and now she found herself at the center of a storm she had never asked to create. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Gideon's face in the grove, unguarded and honest in a way she suspected very few people had ever witnessed, and she hated how much she wanted to see that version of him again. A knock interrupted her thoughts, sharp and urgent. It was not Mira. It was Nora, one of the senior Blackthorn warriors, her expression tight with concern. The council has called an emergency meeting, she said without preamble. Both packs' elders are demanding answers. Edric is stalling as long as he can, but they want to speak with you directly, Alena. Elena's stomach dropped. Me? Why me? Because everyone already suspects it was you in that grove, Nora said bluntly. And if you don't explain yourself before the rumors spiral further, someone else will do it for you, and you won't like the version they tell. Alena followed Nora through the winding stone corridors of the Blackthorn estate, her heart hammering against her ribs with every step. She had imagined 100 different outcomes for this day, none of them involving a council chamber full of suspicious elders demanding to understand why the Alpha King's supposed maid bond had unraveled hours before it was meant to be sealed. The council chamber was smaller than the Great Hall but somehow felt more suffocating, packed tight with elders from both territories seated around a long stone table. Gideon was already there, standing near the far wall with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable in a way that told Alena he had spent the past few hours rebuilding the composure he had lost that morning. Mira sat near the front, her hands twisted together in her lap, and beside her sat their father, Warwick Hartley, the Blackthorn Beta, whose face had gone rigid with a controlled fury Alena had rarely seen directed at her before. Sit, Warwick said, his voice clipped. Alena sat. The head elder, a stern woman named Priya who had overseen pack law for longer than Alena had been alive, folded her hands on the table and studied both twins with a piercing gaze. We are told there was a substitution during last night's private offering, Priya said. A tradition meant to honor the bond between mates was instead used to deceive the Alpha King. This is a serious breach, and it threatens the entire treaty both our packs have worked toward for 3 years. It was not meant to deceive anyone, Alena said quickly, though her voice shook. My sister was frightened. I only meant to deliver the offering in her place for a few minutes. I never intended to stay, and I certainly never intended for anything to happen. And yet something did happen, Priya said, her sharp eyes flicking toward Gideon. Enough to cause the Alpha King to halt his own claiming ceremony on the very morning it was meant to occur. Gideon straightened from where he leaned against the wall, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same commanding weight Alena remembered from the sacred grove, though now it was aimed at an entire room instead of just her. I halted the ceremony because I refused to bind myself to a woman under false pretenses, he said. Mira Hartley did not attend our private meeting. Alena did. And whatever passed between us in that grove was more honest than anything I have experienced in the 3 weeks since this treaty was arranged. A ripple of shocked murmur spread around the table. Warwick's jaw tightened visibly, and he turned to look at Alena with an expression she could not fully read, something between disbelief and quiet calculation. With respect, my king, said an Ashford elder near the end of the table, a broad-shouldered man named Callum, personal feelings cannot override the terms of a treaty this fragile. The bloodline verification specifically named Mira Hartley as your intended mate. Her magic was tested and confirmed stable enough to stabilize a joint throne. We have no such confirmation for her sister. Then test her, Gideon said simply. The room fell silent. Alena felt every eye in the chamber turn toward her at once, and she fought the urge to shrink back into her chair the way she had spent her entire life shrinking whenever attention landed on her instead of her sister. I have never been tested, she said carefully. My gifts were never considered relevant to the treaty. I heal. I sense things others miss. I was never trained the way Mira was trained, because no one expected it to matter. Then perhaps it is time we found out whether it matters after all, Priya said, studying Alena with new interest. A bloodline verification is not a simple request, however. It requires the presence of a pack seer, and the ritual itself carries risk for anyone whose magic has never been tested under pressure. If your gift prove unstable when placed under that kind of strain, the consequences could be severe, both for you and for the treaty itself. Elena's mouth went dry. She had heard stories about failed verifications, wolves whose magic collapsed under the ritual's demands, leaving them weakened for months or, in rare cases, permanently changed in ways no healer could fully repair. The thought of subjecting herself to that kind of risk, especially for a bond she had never asked for and still barely understood, made her chest tighten with fear. But then she looked at Gideon, and she saw something in his expression that surprised her. He looked afraid too, not for himself, but for her, and that quiet concern steadied something inside her chest more than any reassurance from the council could have managed. "I do it," Alena said before she could talk herself out of it. "Alena, no." Myra's voice cut across the room, sharp with alarm. "You don't have to prove anything. This was never supposed to be your burden to carry." "It became my burden the moment I walked into that grove," Alena said quietly, turning to face her sister. "I made a choice last night, even if I didn't fully understand what that choice meant at the time. I won't hide from it now." Warwick finally spoke, his voice low and measured in the way Alena recognized from years of watching him negotiate difficult decisions for the park. "If this verification moves forward, it must happen properly, with full council oversight, and with acknowledgement that the outcome, whatever it may be, will be binding for both parks. I will not have my daughters caught in the middle of a political mess that gets rewritten every time the wind changes direction." Callum, the Ashford elder, exchanged a look with Priya before nodding slowly. "Agreed. If the seer confirms her bloodline is stable enough to support the bond, we will accept the amendment to the treaty. If not, the original arrangement stands, and Mira Hartley will complete the claiming ceremony as originally planned." Elena's stomach twisted at the thought of that alternative, though she said nothing. Beside her, Mira reached for her hand under the table, squeezing it in a silent gesture of support that carried none of the resentment Alena had feared she might feel. Gideon crossed the room until he stood directly in front of Elena's chair, ignoring the way the elders shifted uncomfortably at the breach of formal distance. "You do not have to do this to prove anything to me," he said quietly, his voice pitched just low enough that it felt like the words were meant only for her, even in a room full of people. "Whatever the verification shows, last night was real. I need you to know that, regardless of what happens next." Alena held his gaze, feeling something steady itself in her chest despite the fear coiled tight beneath her ribs. "Then let's find out if it's more than just a feeling," she said. The council seer was summoned before sundown, an ancient woman named Ivy whose milky eyes had long since lost their ability to see color but who could apparently see bloodlines with a clarity no ordinary wolf possessed. She arrived wrapped in layers of grey cloth, moving slowly through the chamber with the aid of a carved wooden staff, and when she finally settled across from Alena, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Give me your hands, child," Ivy said, her voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. Alena extended her trembling hands, and the moment Ivy's cold fingers closed around them, a jolt of energy shot through her entire body, sharp and electric, unlike anything she had ever experienced. Her vision blurred at the edges. Somewhere far away, she heard Mira gasp and Gideon's voice calling her name, but the sound felt distant, muffled, as though she were sinking beneath dark water while the ritual pulled something ancient and unfamiliar to the surface of her blood. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the pressure vanished, leaving Alena gasping for breath in her chair while the entire council chamber stared at her in stunned silence, waiting for the old seer to speak the words that would decide everything. Ivy sat back slowly, her clouded eyes fixed on some point beyond the room that only she could see. For a long moment she said nothing, and the silence stretched so thin that Alena could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. "Her bloodline is not weaker than her sister's," Ivy finally said, her voice carrying an odd note of wonder. "It is simply different. Quieter. The kind of magic that does not announce itself with strength alone, but with patience. In 100 years I have tested many bloodlines claiming to stabilize a throne through force. Hers stabilizes through something rarer. Trust. Loyalty freely given rather than demanded." Priya leaned forward, her expression sharpening. "Are you saying her bloodline is stable enough to support the bond?" "I am saying it is stable enough to support far more than a treaty," Ivy said. "I am saying the wolf inside the Alpha King already recognized this before any of you called me here. My ritual only confirmed what his instincts already knew." Gideon exhaled a breath he had clearly been holding since the moment the ritual began, and when he looked at Alena, something in his expression had shifted from fear into something steadier, something that looked dangerously close to hope. Alena felt her own chest loosen slightly, though the relief was tangled with 100 other emotions she had not yet found time to sort through. Callum, however, was not satisfied. He rose from his seat with his arms folded, addressing the room with the sharp tone of a man who had clearly prepared for this outcome. A confirmed bloodline does not automatically grant permission to rewrite a treaty 3 years in the making, he said. The Ashford Council agreed to this alliance under the understanding that Mira Hartley, specifically, would be the one to stand beside our king. Changing that arrangement now, however emotionally satisfying it may be, sets a dangerous precedent. It tells every future alliance that agreements can be discarded the moment personal feelings intervene. With respect, Warwick said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had spent decades navigating pack politics, "My daughters are not interchangeable pieces on a game board." If the seer confirms Elena's bloodline meets the standard required, then the treaty's original intent, stability through bond, is satisfied regardless of which twin fulfills it. The chamber erupted into overlapping arguments, elders from both sides raising their voices in a tangled debate that Elena could barely follow. She sat frozen in her chair, watching the fate of two packs argued over her head as though she were still the invisible twin, the quiet one whose choices had never mattered until an accident in a dark grove changed everything. It was Mira, surprisingly, who silenced the room. She stood slowly, her chin lifted despite the tremor Elena could see in her hands, and addressed the council directly. "I need to say something, and I need all of you to actually listen," Mira said, her voice steadier than Elena had expected. "I agreed to this bond because I believed it was my duty, not because I ever wanted it. I have cared for someone else for over a year now, someone outside both our packs, and I have said nothing because I did not think my own wishes were allowed to matter against the needs of an entire alliance." A ripple of surprise moved through the elders, though Warwick's expression remained carefully neutral, as though this was not entirely new information to him. "I begged my sister to go to that grove in my place because I could not face pretending to feel something I don't feel," Mira continued. What happened between her and Gideon was never planned, and it was never something either of them set out to create. "But watching the two of them since this morning, I have seen more honesty in a single conversation than I ever managed to imagine building with him myself. If this council truly cares about stability, then force me into a bond one do not want, and see how quickly that instability finds its way back into these walls." The room went quiet in a different way now, heavier, more thoughtful. Priya studied Mira for a long moment before turning her attention to Callum. "The seer has confirmed the required bloodline stability exists in either twin," she said. "The treaty's language never specified which daughter of the Hartley line must fulfill the bond, only that the bloodline itself must be verified. That detail was assumed, not written." Callum's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, apparently unable to find a counterargument sturdy enough to hold against both the seer's ruling and Warwick's calm insistence. Gideon stepped forward then, addressing the council with the same authority Elena imagined he used when settling disputes among his own pack. "I understand the fear that changing this arrangement threatens the credibility of future treaties," he said. "But an alliance built on a lie, even an accidental one, is far more fragile than an alliance amended to reflect the truth. I would rather stand before both our packs and admit that circumstances shifted than stand before them years from now, having built a throne on a foundation neither my mate nor I ever truly believed in." Silence stretched through the chamber as the elders exchanged glances, some reluctant, some visibly relieved, as though they too had sensed the wrongness of the original arrangement but had never found the courage to name it aloud. Finally, Priya rose to her feet, her expression settling into the firm, decisive look Elena imagined she used when closing out decades of pack disputes. "The council will amend the treaty," she announced. "The alliance between the Blackthorn and Ashford packs will stand as originally intended. The mating bond, however, will be fulfilled by Elena Hartley, pending her full and informed consent, given the unusual circumstances surrounding this decision." Every eye in the room turned to Elena. She had spent the entire day swept along by events far larger than herself, buffeted between fear and disbelief and a strange, fragile hope she had barely let herself acknowledge. Now, faced with the actual choice, stripped of politics and duty and the expectations that had shaped every decision in her life until this point, she found herself searching Gideon's face for some final piece of certainty. He crossed the chamber floor until he stood directly before her, ignoring the eyes of the council watching them both. "I will not pretend the next few months will be simple," he said quietly. "There will be wolves in my own pack who resent this change, just as there will be those in yours who question why the arrangement shifted at all. I cannot promise you an easy path. But I can promise you honesty, the same honesty we found in that grove, for as long as you're willing to walk this path with me." Alena thought of every year she had spent standing in her sister's shadow, every moment she had convinced herself that being overlooked was simply her place in the world. She thought of the grove, of Gideon's unguarded voice in the darkness, of the strange, undeniable pull that had followed them both into the morning light and refused to let go despite every obstacle the day had thrown in its path. Yes, she said. I choose this. Not because a treaty demands it, and not because a seer confirmed my bloodline. I choose it because last night was the first time in my life I felt like exactly enough, just as I am. A murmur of approval rippled through part of the chamber, though Callum's expression remained tight with unresolved tension, a warning that this decision, however well-intentioned, might not be accepted as easily by everyone watching from outside these walls. Alena noticed it too, the flicker of something calculating behind his eyes before he masked it with practiced neutrality, and though she said nothing in the moment, a small, uneasy feeling settled into her chest. Word of the council's decision spread through both parks before the sun fully set, and while many wolves gathered in the courtyard celebrated the news with genuine relief, whispering that perhaps this new arrangement carried more promise than the original, Alena caught fragments of a different kind of conversation drifting from smaller, quieter clusters near the outer walls. Not everyone believed the substitution had been an accident. Not everyone believed the council's amendment served the alliance rather than undermining it. As twilight settled over the Blackthorn estate, Nora found Alena standing alone near the training yards, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the distant hills. You should be celebrating, Nora said, though her tone carried a note of caution rather than lightness. I will, Alena said. But something Callum said in that chamber has been sitting wrong with me all evening. He didn't look like a man who lost an argument. He looked like a man who was already planning his next move. Nora's expression sobered. The Ashford Park has always had factions loyal to the old rivalry, wolves who never fully accepted this treaty no matter how it was structured. If Callum has allies among them, changing the terms of the bond, even with the council's blessing, could give them exactly the excuse they've been waiting for to challenge the alliance altogether. Alena wrapped her arms around herself as a cool evening breeze swept across the yard, carrying with it the distant sound of celebration from the main hall, laughter and music rising into a sky just beginning to fill with stars. Somewhere within that joyful noise, Gideon was likely fielding questions from his own advisors, navigating the same undercurrents of doubt that had settled into Elena's chest the moment she noticed Callum's expression. She had spent the entire day fighting for the right to choose her own path, certain that once the choice was made, the hardest part would finally be behind her. Standing in the darkening yard, watching shadows stretch long across the grass, Alena understood with a growing sense of unease that the hardest part had likely not yet begun. She did not have to wait long to find out how right she was. 2 nights later, a messenger arrived at the Blackthorn gates just before midnight, breathless and pale, demanding to speak with Warwick immediately. Alena, unable to sleep since the council's decision, had been sitting near the window of her chambers when she heard the commotion below and hurried down to see what had happened. By the time she reached the entry hall, her father was already deep in conversation with the messenger, his face drawn tight with an expression she rarely saw on him, genuine alarm. What's happened? Alena asked, stepping into the hall. Warwick hesitated, glancing at the messenger before answering. There was an attack on the eastern border tonight. A patrol from the Ashford territory was ambushed while returning from a routine sweep. 2 wolves were injured, one seriously. Elena's stomach dropped. An attack from who? That's the problem, the messenger said, his voice still unsteady. The attackers wore no pack markings, and none of the survivors recognized their scent. But one of the injured wolves swears he heard them mention the treaty before they fled. He says they called it a mistake that needed correcting. A cold, sick feeling settled into Elena's chest. She thought immediately of Callum's tight expression in the council chamber, of Nora's warning about factions within the Ashford Park who had never accepted the alliance, and though she had no proof connecting the attack directly to him, the timing felt far too deliberate to be coincidence. Gideon arrived at the Blackthorn estate before dawn, having ridden through the night the moment word reached him, his expression carved from stone in a way that reminded Alena, uncomfortably, of the cold king she had first seen weeks ago, before the grove, before any of this began. He met with Warwick and the senior warriors from both parks in a tense, close session that lasted well into the morning, and when he finally emerged, he sought out Alena directly, finding her in the quiet corridor outside the meeting room. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, he said without preamble. Always, Alena said. Did anyone approach you, or Mira, in the days before the ceremony? Anyone urging either of you to reconsider the bond, or suggesting the arrangement might not hold? Alena thought back carefully, sifting through the tense, blurred days leading up to the ceremony. No one approached me directly, she said. But Callum's reaction in the council chamber has bothered me since the moment the decision was made. He argued harder against the amendment than anyone else, and when he lost, he didn't look defeated. He looked like he was already planning something else. Gideon's jaw tightened. Callum has never fully trusted this alliance. His family lost 2 sons in the border conflicts before the treaty was signed, and though he agreed to the peace publicly, I have always suspected his loyalty runs deeper to old grudges than to any council decision. If he believes changing the bond from Mira to you weakens the treaty's legitimacy, he may be using that belief to justify actions the rest of the council would never sanction. You think he ordered the attack? Alena said quietly. I think it's possible, Gideon said. And if it's true, it means the danger here isn't just political anymore. It's real, and it's aimed at destabilizing everything we've built in the last few days, possibly by making both packs believe the other side struck first. Alena felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the early morning air. If wolves from both territories start believing the other broke the peace, it won't matter whose fault the attack actually was. The war could start again exactly the way it ended, out of fear and suspicion rather than facts. Exactly, Gideon said grimly. Which is why we need to find proof before the rumors spread any further than they already have. Over the following 2 days, the atmosphere across both territories grew increasingly tense. Patrols doubled along the border. Warriors who had spent years training alongside their former enemies now eyed each other with renewed wariness, old habits of distrust resurfacing faster than anyone had expected. Alena watched the fragile unity she had fought so hard to protect begin fraying at the edges, thread by thread, and she found herself desperate to do something, anything, to stop the unraveling before it became irreversible. It was Nora who finally uncovered the first solid lead, tracking down a scent pattern near the ambush site that matched neither Ashford nor Blackthorn wolves, but instead traced back to a small group of exiled fighters who had been cast out of the Ashford Pack years earlier for their role in an unauthorized raid during the height of the Old War. Callum, it turned out, had maintained quiet contact with several of these exiles ever since, ostensibly to monitor their movements and prevent further trouble, though the pattern of communication suggested something far less innocent than mere surveillance. When Gideon confronted Callum directly, presenting the evidence Nora had gathered in front of the full Ashford Council, Callum did not deny the contact, though he insisted the exiled wolves had acted entirely on their own initiative, without any direction or encouragement from him. I never ordered an attack, Callum said, his voice tight with controlled anger. I only ever wanted to preserve the treaty as it was originally written. If some among the exiles took my concerns as permission to act violently, that responsibility lies with them, not with me. Your concerns were well known to them, Gideon said coldly. You made your objections to this amendment clear in front of the entire council, and days later, wolves connected to you attacked a border patrol under the exact pretense you used to argue against the change. That is not coincidence, Callum. That is consequence. The Ashford Council, shaken by the evidence and unwilling to risk further violence, voted to strip Callum of his seat pending a full investigation into his ties with the exiled fighters. It was not the clean resolution Alena had hoped for, not the kind of ending that erased the danger entirely, but it was enough, for now, to slow the spiral of suspicion threatening to consume both packs. Still, as Alena stood beside Gideon that evening, watching the sun set over territory that had nearly slid back into war within days of finding peace, she could not shake the feeling that Callum's removal from the council was not the end of the danger, but only the closing of its first chapter. She was right. 3 days after Callum's removal from the council, Alena woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices echoing through the Blackthorn estate. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs, finding Warwick and Nora deep in conversation near the front entrance, their expressions grim in a way that made her stomach twist before either of them said a word. What is it now? Alena asked. Nora turned to her, her jaw tight. Mira is missing. Elena's blood went cold. Missing. Since when? Her chambers were empty when her maid went to wake her this morning, Warwick said, his voice carefully controlled despite the fear evident beneath it. Her bed hasn't been slept in. There's no sign of a struggle, but there's no sign of where she went either. Elena's mind raced immediately to the exiled fighters connected to Callum, to the border attack that had nearly reignited a war, and a sick, cold certainty settled into her chest. This is connected to Callum, she said. It has to be. As if summoned by the mention of his name, a Blackthorn warrior burst through the entrance moments later, breathless from running. We found something, he said, holding out a folded piece of parchment sealed with wax bearing no packmark at all, a deliberate omission that made the message feel all the more threatening. It was left near the eastern gate, tucked beneath a stone where the guards would be sure to find it at first light. Warwick broke the seal and unfolded the parchment, his face darkening as he read. Elena leaned over his shoulder, her heart pounding, and read the message herself. The words were simple and cold. Mira Hartley was being held in exchange for the reversal of the council's amendment. If Elena did not publicly withdraw her claim to the mating bond within 2 days, and if the original arrangement naming Mira as Gideon's intended mate was not restored, there would be no guarantee of her safe return. They want to force the treaty back to its original terms, Elena said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. They took Mira to force my hand. Warwick's expression hardened into something Elena had rarely seen from her father, a controlled, focused anger that spoke of decades spent protecting his pack through both diplomacy and force. We will find her, he said. But we need to move carefully. If these exiles are desperate enough to kidnap the daughter of a beta, they may be desperate enough to do something far worse if they believe they are cornered. Gideon arrived within the hour, having been summoned the moment the ransom note was discovered, and the fury barely contained beneath his composed exterior was evident in the tight set of his shoulders and the golden flash that kept threatening to overtake his eyes. This ends now, he said, after reading the note twice, as though hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something less dire on a second reading. I don't care what it takes. We find Mira, and we find every wolf responsible for taking her. They'll expect retaliation, Nora said carefully. If we send warriors charging toward wherever these exiles are hiding, we risk them acting on their threat before we ever reach her. Then we don't charge, Elena said, an idea forming quickly in her mind, born from desperation and the sharp, clear focus that sometimes arrived in the middle of crisis. We negotiate. Publicly, if necessary, in a way that buys us time to locate her actual position without provoking them into panic. Gideon studied her, something like reluctant respect flickering across his expression despite the fear still evident underneath. You want to pretend to consider their demand. I want them to believe they are winning, Elena said. Long enough for Nora and the warriors to track down wherever they are keeping her. It was a dangerous plan, one that required Elena to publicly announce, at least temporarily, that she was reconsidering her place in the treaty, a declaration that would send fresh waves of confusion and doubt through both packs at the worst possible moment. But with Myra's safety hanging in the balance, no one in the room could offer a better alternative, and after a tense round of debate, the council reluctantly agreed to the deception. Elena stood before a gathering of both packs later that afternoon, her heart hammering as she delivered words that felt like poison in her mouth, announcing that she was requesting time to reconsider her claim to the bond given the unrest her decision had caused. She watched confusion and disappointment ripple through the crowd, watched Gideon's carefully neutral expression beside her, knowing that every wolf watching believed they were witnessing genuine doubt rather than a desperate strategy to buy time for a rescue. Meanwhile, Nora and a small group of trusted warriors moved quietly through the forested borderlands beyond Ashford territory, following the faint traces of scent that Nora had first identified days earlier, the same trail connecting Callum to the exiled fighters responsible for the border attack. It took the better part of a day, moving carefully to avoid detection, before they finally located a hidden camp tucked into a rocky ravine several miles beyond the former border markers, well outside territory either pack regularly patrolled. Mira was there, bound but unharmed, guarded by 4 wolves who clearly had not expected anyone to locate their hiding place so quickly. Nora sent word back immediately through a series of coded howls passed between scouts positioned along the return route, and by nightfall, a larger force led by Gideon himself moved swiftly and silently toward the ravine, determined to end the standoff before the 2-day deadline in the ransom note expired. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and carefully controlled, Gideon's warriors overwhelming the small group of exiles before they had any real chance to react to the ambush. Mira was freed within minutes, shaken and exhausted but otherwise unharmed, and the exiles were taken into custody, their interrogation quickly revealing what Alena had already suspected. Callum, despite his removal from the council, had continued directing the exiled fighters from the shadows, determined to force the treaty back to its original terms by any means available, no matter the cost to the fragile peace he claimed to be protecting. Alena rode out to meet the returning party at first light, relief flooding through her the moment she saw Mira, exhausted but very much alive, walking beside Gideon's warhorse with her chin held high despite everything she had endured. "I knew you'd come," Mira said, pulling Alena into a fierce embrace the moment she dismounted. "I never doubted it for a second." "I'm so sorry," Alena said, her voice thick with emotion. "This never should have happened. If I hadn't chosen the bond, if I had just stepped back and let things stay the way they were originally arranged." "Don't," Mira said firmly, pulling back to look her sister directly in the eyes. "This isn't your fault. This is the fault of a man who could not accept peace unless it looked exactly the way he wanted it to look. You didn't create this danger, Alena. You simply refused to let fear decide your future, and I have never been more proud to call you my sister." Gideon approached them both, his expression softening for the first time since the crisis began, though the exhaustion of the past 2 days remained etched clearly across his features. "Callum will be found," he said. "Every warrior in both territories is searching for him now. He will answer for what he's done, to your family and to the peace we've all worked to protect." Alena nodded, though the relief flooding through her at Myra's safe return was tempered by the knowledge that Callum himself remained unaccounted for, somewhere beyond the reach of the warriors who had rescued Mira, still carrying with him whatever desperate plans he had left to unleash before this conflict finally reached its end. As the returning party made its way back toward the safety of the Blackthorn estate, Alena found herself walking beside Gideon in a rare moment of quiet amid the chaos of the past several days. "We're not finished with this, are we?" she said softly. Gideon's expression remained grim. "No," he admitted. "Not until Callum is found, and not until both packs fully believe this peace is stable enough to survive challenges like the one we just faced. But we're closer than we were 3 days ago. And whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Alena reached for his hand, finding a strange comfort in the simple gesture despite the uncertainty still hanging over both their futures. "Together," she repeated, and for the first time since the chaos began, the word did not feel like a burden, but like a promise she intended to keep, no matter what challenges still waited for them in the days ahead. The search for Callum continued through the following week, warriors from both packs combing the forested borderlands and questioning anyone who might have crossed paths with him since his disappearance. Alena spent those days at Myra's side, helping her recover from the ordeal, though her sister proved remarkably resilient, insisting within 2 days that she felt well enough to resume her usual duties advising the Blackthorn Council on matters of pack law. "You don't have to prove anything," Alena told her one evening, as they sat together in Myra's chambers, the fire casting warm light across the room. "I know," Mira said. "But sitting still and thinking about what happened isn't helping me feel better. Staying busy is." Alena understood the sentiment more than she expected to. She had spent the past several days feeling useless in the search for Callum, her healing gift offering little value in tracking a fugitive through unfamiliar terrain, and the restlessness had begun to gnaw at her in quiet moments between visits to Myra's chambers and brief updates from Gideon about the ongoing search. It was during one such quiet moment, walking alone through the estate's herb gardens in the early evening, that Alena noticed something odd, a faint, unfamiliar scent lingering near the garden's outer wall, one that did not match any wolf she recognized from either pack. Her pulse quickened as she recalled Nora's earlier description of the exile scent pattern, distinct enough that any trained tracker would recognize it once exposed to the memory. She followed the trail carefully, staying low along the garden wall, until she spotted a figure crouched near the servants' entrance at the estate's rear, cloaked despite the mild evening air. Elena's breath caught. She recognized the build immediately, the same broad shoulders she remembered from the council chamber weeks earlier. Callum. She should have called for help immediately. She knew that even as she considered her next move, knew that confronting a desperate, cornered man alone was exactly the kind of reckless decision Gideon would caution her against. But some instinct, sharper than fear, told her that if she made noise now, Callum would simply vanish again into the darkness, and the danger hanging over both parks would continue indefinitely. Instead, she circled quietly toward the estate's main hall, moving as fast as she dared without alerting him to her presence, and found Nora just inside the entrance, discussing patrol routes with two junior warriors. "He's here," Alena whispered urgently. "Callum." "Near the servants' entrance, by the herb gardens." Nora's expression sharpened instantly, years of training overriding any hesitation. She signaled the two warriors with a sharp gesture, and within moments a small, silent group moved swiftly toward the garden's rear wall, Alena trailing just behind them despite Nora's quiet warning to stay back. They found Callum exactly where Alena had left him, though his posture had shifted, tense and alert, as though some instinct of his own had warned him time was running short. When he spotted the approaching warriors, he did not run, which surprised Alena more than anything else that evening. Instead, he straightened slowly, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender that felt strangely hollow given everything he had orchestrated over the past several days. "I assume Mira made it home safely," he said, his voice carrying none of the venom Alena expected, only a tired, resigned weariness that made him seem far smaller than the calculating figure who had argued so fiercely against the treaty amendment weeks earlier. "She did," Nora said coldly. "No thanks to you." "I never intended for her to be harmed," Callum said. "I only wanted the treaty restored to its original terms my council agreed to, terms that promised stability my family desperately needed after losing two sons to a war that never should have lasted as long as it did." "And you thought kidnapping was the way to secure that stability," Alena said, stepping forward despite Nora's warning glance. Callum's gaze settled on her, something complicated passing across his weathered features. "I thought forcing the situation back to its original shape would prevent further chaos," he said. "I see now that I was wrong. The exiles I contacted acted with far more violence than I intended, and I bear responsibility for setting events in motion I could not fully control. I am prepared to answer for that before both councils." The warriors moved to restrain him, and he offered no resistance, his shoulders slumping with an exhaustion that seemed to carry the weight of years rather than mere days. As they led him away toward the estate's holding cells, Alena remained standing near the garden wall, watching the scene unfold with a strange mixture of relief and unexpected sympathy, understanding, even as she condemned his actions, the desperate grief that had driven a man to such extremes in the name of protecting a peace he genuinely believed was worth saving. Word reached Gideon within the hour, and he arrived at the estate shortly after, finding Alena still in the gardens, watching the last light fade from the evening sky. "It's over," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Is it?" Alena asked. "Callum's capture ends this particular threat. But I don't think the doubts he represented disappear just because he's been caught. There will always be wolves in both parks who see peace as fragile, who believe the old ways of proving strength through conflict are safer than trusting something as uncertain as a mating bond built on honesty instead of bloodline calculation." Gideon considered her words carefully, the golden hue that had flickered in his eyes throughout the crisis finally settling back into their usual deep, steady brown. "Then we proved them wrong," he said. "Not through grand gestures or forced declarations, but through the simple, ongoing work of showing both parks that this bond, however unconventional its beginning, can hold steady through exactly the kind of storm we just weathered together." Alena leaned into him slightly, exhaustion from the past week finally catching up with her all at once. "That sounds like a lot of work," she said, a faint, tired smile touching her lips despite everything. "It is," Gideon agreed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "But I find I'm no longer afraid of the work, not when I finally understand what I'm working to protect." Callum's trial before the combined council took place 3 days later, a solemn affair conducted with none of the chaos that had defined the previous weeks. He offered no defense beyond what he had already confessed in the garden, and the council, weighing his family's losses during the old war against the genuine harm his actions had caused, settled on permanent exile rather than the harsher punishment some of the more vengeful elders had initially demanded. Gideon argued firmly for mercy, insisting that meeting Callum's desperation with cruelty would only plant the seeds for future conflict rather than closing this chapter cleanly, and the council, weary from the crisis and eager to move forward, ultimately agreed. With Callum's exile finalized and the exiled fighters responsible for the border attack and Myra's kidnapping placed under permanent watch, the fragile peace that had nearly shattered over the past 2 weeks began, slowly, to stabilize once more. Patrols along the border eased back into their usual rhythm. Wolves from both packs who had eyed each other with fresh suspicion during the crisis gradually returned to the cautious, hard-won camaraderie they had built over the preceding 3 years. And Alena, watching the tension finally begin to lift from the shoulders of everyone around her, understood that the time had come to complete what an accidental night in the sacred grove had first set in motion. The new ceremony was arranged for the following week, timed deliberately to coincide with the full moon, considered by both packs' traditions to be the most auspicious time for sealing a mating bond. Unlike the first attempt, rushed and tangled in political calculation, this ceremony carried a different quality entirely, one built on weeks of tested loyalty rather than untested assumption. Alena stood in her chambers on the morning of the ceremony, watching Mira fuss over the final adjustments to her simple, elegant gown, made from pale silver fabric that caught the early light streaming through the window. "You look happy," Mira said, studying her sister's reflection in the mirror. "Genuinely happy." "It suits you." "I am happy," Alena admitted, smoothing a hand over the fabric at her waist. "Though I still can't quite believe how we got here. A few weeks ago I was standing in your shadow at the edge of the Blackthorn Hills, certain my whole life would be spent being the twin no one chose." "I never wanted you to feel that way," Mira said softly. "I know I never said it clearly enough, but I always admired you, Alena. Your gifts were never smaller than mine. They were just quieter, and the world has always been louder about the things it wants to celebrate." Alena reached for her sister's hand, squeezing it gently. "What about you?" she asked. "Now that the treaty no longer requires anything of you, what happens next?" Myra's expression softened into something Alena had not seen on her face in a very long time, a genuine, unguarded happiness. "I've been given permission to visit the Ferngrove territory next month," she said. "To see about a formal courtship, now that I'm finally free to choose for myself." "The boy our parents would never approve of," Alena said, smiling. "The very same," Mira confirmed, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Though I suspect after everything we've all just survived, our father's objections might finally soften a little." The ceremony itself took place in the same clearing that bordered both territories, a neutral space chosen deliberately to symbolize the union of two once warring packs. Alena walked toward the gathered crowd with Warwick at her side, his expression carrying a quiet pride that filled her chest with warmth she had not expected to feel this deeply. Hundreds of wolves from both territories had gathered beneath the rising moon, their earlier suspicion and unease replaced now by a cautious, hopeful anticipation that Alena could feel radiating through the crowd like warmth from a fire. Gideon waited for her at the center of the clearing, dressed simply despite his position, his expression holding none of the guarded coldness she remembered from their very first meeting weeks earlier. When their eyes met across the clearing, something settled deep in Elena's chest, a certainty she had spent weeks fighting to trust fully, now finally arriving without hesitation or fear. "We have gathered here," Priya announced, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing, not to witness a treaty fulfilled through obligation, but a bond chosen freely, between two packs and two hearts that found each other through circumstances none of us could have planned, yet none of us can deny were exactly as they needed to be. Alena reached Gideon's side, and he took her hands in his grip warm and steady despite the weight of everything they had both endured to reach this moment. "Weeks ago," Gideon said, his voice carrying across the silent clearing, "I stood in a sacred grove intending to secure peace for my pack through duty alone. Instead, I found honesty I did not know I was missing, and a connection I could not have predicted no matter how carefully I planned for this alliance. Alena Hartley, I do not claim you tonight because a council demanded it, or because a bloodline was verified, or because a treaty required it. I claim you because you are the first person who ever made me feel like more than just a king, and because every day since that night in the grove, I have wanted nothing more than to build a life beside you, built on the same honesty we found by accident, and have chosen deliberately ever since." Alena felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though they were nothing like the fear and uncertainty that had accompanied so much of the past few weeks. "I spent my whole life believing I was the twin no one would choose," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion thick in her throat. "I told myself that being overlooked was simply my place in the world, and I had made peace with that belief long before I ever expected anything to change it. But you saw me, Gideon, in the one moment I never expected to be seen, and everything since has taught me that being chosen for love, rather than duty, is worth every danger we face to protect it. I claim you too, not because fate arranged an accident in a grove, but because I have chosen you every single day since, with clear eyes and a full heart. The formal bonding words followed, ancient and solemn, spoken beneath the full moon as both packs bore witness to a union that had begun in confusion and danger but had settled, through weeks of trial, into something neither Alena nor Gideon doubted any longer. When the final words were spoken and the bond sealed, a cheer rose from the gathered crowd, warriors from both Blackthorn and Ashford territories celebrating together with a warmth that would have seemed impossible only a month earlier. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around the clearing, Alena stood slightly apart from the crowd with Gideon, watching the bonfires cast dancing light across the faces of wolves who had once considered each other enemies and now laughed and danced together beneath the same moon. "Do you regret any of it?" Gideon asked quietly, watching her study the crowd. "The danger, the chaos, everything we went through to reach this moment." Alena considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret that Mira was hurt because of choices I made," she said. "I regret that Callum's grief drove him to such desperate actions. But I do not regret the growth, and I do not regret choosing honesty over duty, even when it seemed like the more dangerous path. If I had stayed quiet that night, if I had corrected your mistake the moment I realized you didn't recognize me, none of this would have happened. But I also would have spent the rest of my life wondering what might have been possible if I had simply told the truth." Gideon pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers as the sounds of celebration swirled around them. "I have ruled this pack for years, Alena, always alone, always certain that duty and loneliness were simply the price of the crown I carried. I never expected an accidental night in a sacred grove to teach me otherwise. But I am endlessly grateful that it did." Alena smiled, leaning into him fully now, letting the warmth of the bonfires and the steady, certain beat of his heart against hers settle every last trace of doubt that had lingered since that very first morning in the grove. Whatever challenges still waited for them as they worked to build a lasting peace between two packs, whatever old grudges and fresh doubts they would need to face together in the months and years ahead, Alena understood, standing beneath the full moon with her hand held firmly in Gideon's, that she had finally found exactly where she belonged. Not chosen for power, and not chosen for bloodline magic or political convenience. Chosen simply, entirely, for love. And as the moon climbed higher above the clearing where two warring packs now stood united, Alena knew without a single doubt that whatever storm still waited on the horizon, she would face every single one of them exactly where she was always meant to be, standing beside the king who had looked past a crown and a treaty and found, instead, a woman worth choosing with his whole heart.